June 1942, Midway Atoll. The Pacific is on fire. Columns of black smoke twist into the sky, merging with clouds that taste of oil and salt. Below them, what was once a proud carrier burns, its deck shattered, aircraft melting in silence. Japanese pilots, circling above, radio back with triumph in their voices. Enemy carrier confirmed destroyed. From Tokyo to Truk Lagoon, the message spreads like a storm. The Imperial Japanese Navy has done the impossible, struck down the last of America's aircraft carriers. Admirals toast in subdued satisfaction, believing the Pacific now belongs to Japan. But somewhere in the ruins of Pearl Harbor, American engineers are already at work. Sparks fly in the night as welders rebuild twisted steel. Across the ocean, shipyards hum like living organisms, silent cities of fire and steel, repairing what should have been dead. Weeks later, Japanese reconnaissance planes scan the horizon near the Solomon Islands. There, rising from the mist, is the unmistakable silhouette of an American carrier. The same class, the same markings, the same ship they had sunk. For the first time, the Japanese admirals hesitate. The enemy they thought they had destroyed had returned. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, it believed it had crippled the U.S. Navy beyond recovery. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet seemed annihilated. Battleships lay overturned, airfields burned, and 2,400 Americans were dead. But amid that chaos, a small truth escaped the Japanese high command. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port that morning. Those floating airfields would soon become the lifeline of a wounded navy. Through the opening months of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy dominated the Pacific. Their first air fleet, the Kido Butai, was unmatched in skill and coordination. 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and pilots honed by years of combat in China. Every battle followed the same rhythm. Japan struck first, hard, and from the sky. The U.S. Navy, outnumbered and disoriented, could do little but retreat and regroup. By the spring of 1942, Japan's expansion seemed unstoppable. The rising sun flew over vast stretches of the Pacific, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from the Coral Sea to the Aleutians. Tokyo newspapers declared that America had lost its sea power. Even among Allied circles, the tone was grim. The Pacific had become a Japanese lake. Yet, in that same desperate spring, American naval officers were already adapting. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, realized that survival depended not on battleships, but on carriers. These flat-topped ships, once considered auxiliary support units, now held the key to striking back. In May 1942 came the Battle of the Coral Sea, the world's first carrier versus carrier engagement. It was a brutal, chaotic exchange. The U.S. lost the Lexington, a ship so massive that her final explosion could be seen miles away. The Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor, heavily damaged, her decks torn open, and her boilers leaking. To the Japanese, both ships were finished. Intelligence reports claimed that the Americans had only one operational carrier left in the entire Pacific, the Enterprise. But what Tokyo didn't know was that, at Pearl Harbor, an army of engineers, divers, and mechanics had begun a race against time. Admiral Nimitz ordered Yorktown repaired in 3 days, an impossible deadline that should have taken 3 months. Night and day, 400 men worked in silence. Welders cut and replaced steel, electricians rerouted burned circuits, painters sealed the hull. Oil still oozed from her sides as she left dry dock. On June 2, 1942, less than 72 hours after her arrival, Yorktown sailed for Midway. That single decision would alter the course of the Pacific War. At Midway, Japan hoped to destroy the remaining American carriers and secure its defensive perimeter once and for all. The battle raged over 3 days, June 4th to 6th, in a storm of fire, smoke, and chaos. When it ended, 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay at the bottom of the sea. Yorktown was lost too, struck by bombs and torpedoes. But her sacrifice was not in vain. In Tokyo, disbelief rippled through the naval staff. The empire had lost the heart of its offensive power. Still, they believed the American carriers had suffered the same fate. In their minds, both sides had paid equally, and time was on Japan's side. Yet within weeks, new names began appearing on the Pacific waves. Hornet, Wasp, and later Essex. The Americans, it seemed, had endless ships. To the Japanese, it felt as though their enemies were pulling carriers from the sea itself. The legend of the unsinkable American carriers had begun. In the summer of 1942, confusion began spreading inside the corridors of Japan's Naval General Staff in Tokyo. Reports were arriving from scattered corners of the Pacific, the Solomon Islands, the Coral Sea, the Gilberts, all carrying the same bewildering observation. American aircraft carriers, supposedly destroyed, were fighting again. One reconnaissance pilot reported sighting the Enterprise leading a new task force near Guadalcanal. Another patrol plane, flying over the New Hebrides, swore it saw the Yorktown. That couldn't be true. Japanese bombers had hit her with precision at Midway, watched her list, burn, and sink beneath the waves. The Yorktown was gone, or so they believed. At first, the Japanese staff dismissed the reports as mistakes, confusion between carrier classes or perhaps deliberate Allied deception. But soon, the sightings became too frequent, too consistent to ignore. The same ship names kept reappearing, the same silhouettes, the same vengeance in the air. And behind those illusions was something Japan had not fully understood: America's capacity to rebuild faster than any nation in history. While Japan celebrated its early conquests, the United States had become a continent of industry. Every factory, every dock, every assembly line had been absorbed into the war effort. The American home front turned itself into a weapon. Steel from Pittsburgh, copper from Montana, oil from Texas, timber from Oregon, all funneled toward one purpose: to rebuild a navy that refused to die. At Pearl Harbor, the harbor that once symbolized defeat, the sound of hammers and welding torches replaced the echo of bombs. The air was heavy with smoke and molten metal. Men worked in 12-hour shifts, sleeping on the decks of half-repaired ships, eating beside their torches. They weren't just fixing vessels. They were resurrecting them. Ships that had been thought lost. The West Virginia, the California, the Nevada were lifted from the mud, drained, patched, and reborn. And while battleships were slowly restored, America's gaze had shifted elsewhere, toward the new queens of the sea, the aircraft carriers. The lesson from Coral Sea and Midway was clear. Battleships were relics. The future of naval warfare floated on flat, steel decks from which hundreds of aircraft could launch destruction far beyond the horizon. So the United States poured its soul into building them. Not one or two, but dozens. In May 1942, when the Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor after the Coral Sea, her hull was torn, her boilers cracked, and her crew exhausted. Naval engineers estimated 3 months for full repairs. Admiral Nimitz gave them 72 hours. The order was madness, yet no one protested. Over 1,000 men descended on the carrier day and night. Floodlights burned across the docks as cranes swung armor plates and welders carved sparks into the night sky. 3 days later, Yorktown sailed again, patched, leaking, but alive. She would fight at Midway. She would help sink Soryu and Hiryu. And though she was finally lost, the men who repaired her proved something extraordinary. America could rebuild faster than Japan could destroy. That realization, though it took months to reach Tokyo, changed the psychology of the war. Japan's shipbuilding industry, though skilled, was small and rigid. Its great naval yards, Kure, Yokosuka, Sasebo, relied on craftsmanship and precision, building ships one at a time like works of art. Every vessel was a masterpiece of engineering, but each one required years of labor. The Americans approached shipbuilding as a science of repetition. They broke ships into modular sections, constructing pieces in different factories, some hundreds of miles apart, and assembling them like enormous puzzles. At the Newport News Shipbuilding Company, sections of new Essex-class carriers were rolled out on rails, each segment stamped with a number, each built by teams who specialized in that single part. It was industrial choreography, efficient, relentless, unstoppable. By late 1943, ship names began rolling out faster than anyone could memorize them. Essex, Bunker Hill, Hancock, Ticonderoga, Franklin, Lexington II. Each one carried a battle group of destroyers, cruisers, and supply ships, entire, floating cities of war. While Japan's greatest, engineers labored over a single supercarrier like the Shinano. A vessel so secret, it was hidden inside a dry dock. The U.S. Navy launched dozens for the men who had survived Coral Sea, Midway, and the early defeats. The experience of stepping aboard the same names, Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, Hornet, was deeply emotional. These ships were not identical replacements. They were reincarnations, stronger, faster, more heavily armed, carrying the memories of the crews who had once fought and died on their predecessors. To Japanese sailors facing them across the Pacific, it was as if these ships had risen from the deep. In pilot briefings, officers warned their air crews that reports of ghost carriers were enemy propaganda. Yet the fear persisted. When U.S. Task Force 58 appeared off the Marianas in 1944 with carriers named Lexington and Hornet, some Japanese pilots hesitated. The names were cursed. They had already sunk those ships. The legend began to spread. The Americans could not be sunk. Behind the symbolism lay an even greater truth. Philosophy. Japan's military culture, bound by Bushido and the honor of decisive battle, treated loss as final. A sunk ship was a wound to national pride. The United States treated loss as information. Every destroyed carrier became a data point for improvement. Where Japan saw defeat, America saw iteration. Every new Essex-class ship featured refinements from the last. Larger hangars, better elevators, stronger hulls, improved radar, more efficient arresting gear. And each ship was accompanied by dozens of escort carriers, supply vessels, and oilers, the infrastructure of a global navy. This logistical machine allowed the U.S. to project power across 6,000 miles of ocean, something no other navy in history had done. By early 1943, the balance was visibly shifting. The Guadalcanal campaign, once seen as a desperate defense, had become a proving ground for American endurance. Carrier groups rotated in and out of the South Pacific like clockwork. When one was damaged, it sailed home, and another immediately replaced it. Japan, meanwhile, had no replacements. Every lost pilot, every damaged ship, was irreplaceable. Admiral Yamamoto, weary and realistic, confided to a close aide before his death in 1943. The Americans repair their carriers faster than we can sink them. They build planes faster than we can train pilots. He had foreseen the truth. The war Japan thought it could win through decisive blows had transformed into one of production, and Japan had entered a contest it could never hope to match. By 1944, when the Essex fleet rolled eastward, Japan's naval staff finally understood what the early sightings had meant. The American carriers hadn't just returned. They had multiplied. The ghosts had become an army. The legend of the resurrected carriers would now collide with reality in the Central Pacific, as the Imperial Navy faced a power unlike anything it had ever encountered. A fleet that refused to die. In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy viewed itself as the master of the Pacific. Its carrier pilots were elite, its fleet coordination unmatched. The Kido Butai had struck Pearl Harbor, destroyed Allied fleets in the Philippines, and humiliated Western powers that had dominated Asia for centuries. Every engagement reinforced the same belief, that Japan's victory was destiny. So when reports began surfacing of American carriers reappearing after confirmed sinkings, the reaction was not fear, it was disbelief. Intelligence officers in Tokyo reviewed reconnaissance photos and debated endlessly. Were the Americans renaming older ships, repainting hulls to confuse the enemy? Or were the reports simply wrong? But the truth kept closing in. The Enterprise, damaged 3 times, kept reappearing in combat reports at Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and Guadalcanal. The Hornet, sunk in late 1942, was supposedly sighted again the following year. When the Lexington's name returned on the radio logs in 1943, Admiral Ugaki's diary noted bitterly, "It is as if the Americans can resurrect ships." This wasn't just superstition. For the Japanese naval culture, rooted in the ideal of decisive battle, the concept of an enemy that refused to stay destroyed was psychologically destabilizing. Their entire doctrine depended on annihilation, a single perfect victory that would force peace. Yet each American carrier sunk seemed to be replaced almost instantly by another of the same name, larger and deadlier than before. The Imperial Navy began to realize it was fighting not just an opponent, but a system, an industrial organism that could not be killed in the traditional sense. While Japan's admirals obsessed over tactics and honor, America's war leaders obsessed over production schedules. The miracle wasn't just in the shipyards, it was in the organization of war itself. At the height of the conflict, over 3.4 million Americans worked directly in naval production. Each major carrier represented over 1,000 companies contributing components, from radar systems in New Jersey to steel plating in Pittsburgh, turbines from Ohio, and aircraft from California. The result was staggering. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States launched 122 aircraft carriers of various classes, fleet, light, and escort combined. Japan built only 16. Behind these numbers lay the secret weapon of the war: logistics. American carriers didn't sail alone. Each task force carried an invisible lifeline: oilers, ammunition ships, repair tenders, and hospital vessels. The Navy's floating docks and mobile shipyards could fix battle damage hundreds of miles from any port. This industrial muscle meant that even if a carrier was struck, it could often be patched, rearmed, and back in combat within weeks. At Pearl Harbor, damaged hulls were once pulled by tugboats. By 1944, entire carriers were being rearmed at sea. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, had no such support chain. Every major repair required returning to the home islands, a voyage of thousands of miles through submarine-infested waters. Every loss hurt twice, once in battle, and again in the impossibility of recovery. The result was inevitable. America's shipyards fought with the same persistence as its sailors. Every time Japan sank a carrier, it was like cutting off the head of a creature that immediately grew 2 more. When Japan sank the Yorktown at Midway, it celebrated what it thought was a permanent blow to the U.S. Navy's power projection. But the engineers of the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships were already studying every failure, every design flaw, every missed opportunity. The American approach was pragmatic and data-driven. After each battle, damage reports were compiled, photographed, and analyzed by engineers, architects, and mathematicians. The result was an evolving design language that turned shipbuilding into a continuous feedback loop. By the time the Essex-class carriers entered service in 1943, they embodied every lesson learned in Fire and Blood. Armored flight decks that could withstand direct bomb hits, improved damage control systems, automatic fire suppression, and redundant pumps, wider hangars and faster elevators, allowing planes to launch at double the rate of earlier models. Advanced radar suites capable of detecting incoming attacks long before visual contact. But it wasn't just about construction. It was about philosophy. Japanese carriers like Akagi and Kaga had been masterpieces of craftsmanship, but they were designed for short wars. Fast, lethal, decisive. American carriers were designed for long endurance, modular enough to repair, refit, or evolve. By 1944, the Essex class became the backbone of the U.S. Navy. 24 of them served in the Pacific, forming rotating task groups that overwhelmed Japanese defenses from the Gilberts to the Philippines. The Imperial Navies, once superior aircraft, the Zero and Val, were now met by waves of Hellcats and Corsairs launched from decks the Japanese thought they had already sent to the bottom. The technological war had turned, and Japan's innovation could no longer keep pace with America's industrial evolution. Each of these angles, shock, industry, and technology, reveals part of the transformation. But beneath them all runs a deeper current: human endurance and psychological warfare, the next layer of the story. For the American sailors who lived through the early disasters of 1942, the sight of those same carrier names returning to sea was almost spiritual. Men who had escaped burning decks at Coral Sea or Midway suddenly found themselves standing once again beneath the same flight deck insignias. Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp. When Lexington II was commissioned in February 1943, veterans of the first Lexington were invited to attend. Many stood silently on the dock, caps held to their chests, staring up at the ship that bore the name of the one they had lost. Some wept quietly. Others whispered, "She's back." It wasn't superstition, it was continuity. The names of those ships had become memorials, floating tributes to sacrifice, but also a promise of renewal. Every new hull carried the lineage of the old one. Each rising flight deck symbolized the same message that echoed from Pearl Harbor's wrecks to the farthest Pacific atoll. We're not done. For Japan's pilots, the opposite emotion took hold. By late 1943, veteran aviators were vanishing faster than replacements could be trained. The faces in carrier-ready rooms were younger, the confidence thinner. When they saw the same ship names again, Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, it created a haunting sense of futility. How could you destroy an enemy that rebuilt faster than you could reload? Psychologists in post-war interviews described it as a creeping realization of inevitability. Every sortie launched against the Americans felt like fighting the ocean itself. Endless, absorbing, and mercilessly repetitive. Wars are not only fought with weapons, but with perception. By 1943, the myth of the unsinkable American carriers had become as real as any fleet in the Pacific. American newsreels, factory posters, and radio broadcasts fed that legend intentionally. Propaganda films showed shipyard workers hammering steel with slogans like, "They sink one, we build two." Each new launch ceremony was filmed, scored with orchestral music, and broadcast nationwide. The message was unmistakable. You cannot defeat a nation that keeps coming back. The Japanese side, meanwhile, lived in a fog of secrecy and denial. High Command restricted bad news, even from its own officers. Naval intelligence officers at Truk Lagoon noted how morale began to slip whenever they heard familiar ship names in intercepted radio traffic. Some commanders refused to brief their pilots on enemy names, calling it psychological pollution. Yet the more Japan tried to suppress the myth, the stronger it became. By 1944, American carrier groups were arriving in such numbers that Japanese scouts often overcounted them, mistaking refueling groups and escort carriers for fleet carriers. Tokyo's naval staff concluded, incorrectly, that the Americans possessed over 50 major carriers. In truth, they had fewer, but the illusion was strategically powerful. The Imperial Navy began avoiding large-scale engagements, conserving what little remained. That hesitation, born from the fear of an immortal fleet, would cost Japan dearly in the battles to come. No two admirals symbolized the contrasting spirits of the Pacific War more than Isoroku Yamamoto and Chester W. Nimitz. Yamamoto, brilliant yet fatalistic, had studied in the United States and understood its potential. He knew that Japan could not outbuild America. Before Pearl Harbor, he warned Japan's leadership, "For 6 months I will run wild, but after that, I have no confidence." He was right. By 1943, Yamamoto's frustration grew as reports of American recoveries reached him. He read of Yorktown's rapid repair before Midway, of new carriers appearing in the Solomons. His private letters carried a tone of weary admiration for American resolve. He understood what his subordinates refused to see. Japan's war was already lost the moment it underestimated American industry. Nimitz, on the other hand, embodied calm pragmatism. A Texan engineer by training, he saw warfare as logistics and timing, not emotion. While Japan sought glory, Nimitz sought momentum. He rarely spoke of revenge, only of rebuilding, rearming, and striking efficiently. His command style turned the Pacific Fleet into a living machine, flexible, rational, and relentlessly forward-moving. When one carrier was damaged, another immediately filled its place. When pilots were lost, training programs doubled. When parts were scarce, factories were retooled. Under Nimitz's direction, the U.S. Navy functioned less like an armada and more like a system of regeneration. The contrast could not have been greater. Yamamoto led through inspiration and daring, bold but brittle. Nimitz led through endurance, steady, mechanical, and unstoppable. When Yamamoto was killed in 1943, shot down during an inspection flight, his death became symbolic. Japan had lost not only a commander, but the last man who truly understood what they were up against. The Pacific. June 19, 1944. The dawn broke over a sea of glass, calm, blue, and deceptive. To the east of the Mariana Islands, over 700 American aircraft waited silently on carrier decks. Their ships stretched across the horizon like a steel archipelago. Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Essex, Wasp, Bunker Hill, and dozens more. Many of these names Japanese officers had heard before and believed destroyed. Yet here they were again, reborn and multiplied, their decks filled with aircraft painted with white stars. The names that once vanished in smoke had returned like ghosts, and this time they were legion. This day would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, one of the most one-sided air battles in history. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the U.S. Fifth Fleet. His carrier task groups under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher waited patiently, radar screens glowing in the darkened command rooms. To the west, the Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa advanced, 9 carriers strong, carrying the last hopes of Japan's naval air power. For Japan, this was a desperate gamble. Fuel shortages, poor training, and obsolete aircraft plagued the fleet. Many pilots had less than 100 hours of flight experience. Some had never landed on a carrier at sea. But Tokyo demanded results. If the Americans seized the Marianas, Japan's defensive perimeter would collapse. And so, on that summer morning, the final contest began. Shortly before 10 a.m., American radar detected the first Japanese strike groups, 275 miles out. Within minutes, dozens of Hellcats roared off the decks of Lexington and Yorktown, climbing into the bright sky. For the Japanese aviators, it was like flying into history's echo. The names of their opponents' carriers, blaring across radio intercepts, were painfully familiar. Many shouted in disbelief, "Lexington! She was sunk at Coral Sea. Yorktown? Impossible!" But disbelief quickly turned to chaos. The American radar network, fighter coordination, and disciplined communication turned the sky into a slaughterhouse. Wave after wave of inexperienced Japanese pilots met disciplined interceptors guided from ships below. Hellcats tore through the formations, their 50-caliber guns shredding fragile aircraft before they could even dive. By noon, hundreds of flaming trails streaked across the Pacific. Pilots described the scene as a burning rain of planes. One Japanese carrier officer, watching through binoculars, whispered, "This is the end of the Imperial Navy." In the span of one day, Japan lost over 350 carrier aircraft, nearly all of its trained pilots. The Americans lost fewer than 30. From the decks of Enterprise and Lexington, sailors watched the burning horizon with grim satisfaction. They remembered those early, bitter years, 1942, when everything seemed lost. Now, the same ship names that once sank beneath the waves were avenging their own deaths. Even the Japanese intelligence officers were stunned. Reports arriving in Tokyo that evening listed American carrier names long assumed sunk: Lexington, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp, Enterprise. The news created confusion among naval analysts. Some thought the Americans had resurrected the actual ships from the sea. Others believed these were false call signs meant to demoralize Japan. In reality, it was far simpler and far more terrifying. America had simply built new ships, faster than Japan could comprehend. By 1944, the U.S. Navy possessed over 100 aircraft carriers of various classes, including light and escort types. Shipyards in San Francisco, Norfolk, and Brooklyn worked day and night. Assembly lines produced hulls like automobiles. What Japan destroyed in a year, America replaced in a month. The resurrection was no illusion. It was industrial resurrection, forged from steel, sweat, and mass production. By the evening of June 20th, the Japanese fleet was broken. 4 carriers, Hiyo, Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Taiho, were aflame or sinking. The sea that once echoed with the thunder of the rising sun navy now burned under American airstrikes. At sunset, Admiral Mitcher made a fateful decision. Though it meant risking his pilots in darkness, he ordered a night strike. "Turn on the lights," he commanded, ordering carriers to illuminate their decks with floodlights to guide returning aircraft. It was an act of supreme confidence and coordination that Japan could no longer match. The Ghost Fleet glowed across the ocean. Thousands of lights reflected on black water as American pilots returned home. The surviving flyers described the sight as otherworldly, a constellation of ships reborn, stretching from horizon to horizon. For the Japanese, the psychological effect was devastating. They had thrown everything they had into one last strike, and it had vanished into the sea. The myth of American vulnerability was dead. The myth of their own invincibility had died with it. The Battle of the Philippine Sea wasn't just a military defeat. It was the death of an idea. The Japanese Navy had believed that courage and tradition could overcome industry and time. But as the ocean burned beneath the light of resurrected American carriers, that illusion finally drowned. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's empire was collapsing in slow motion. The American landings on Leyte, in the central Philippines, threatened to cut Japan off from its vital oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. If the Philippines fell, the empire would be strangled, and so Tokyo prepared its last great gamble, Operation Shogo I. It was a plan born of desperation and illusion. The idea: lure the main U.S. carrier force away from Leyte Gulf, using a decoy fleet of nearly empty Japanese carriers, while powerful surface forces, including battleships Yamato and Musashi, would charge through the Philippines and annihilate the vulnerable American landing forces. It was a plan so audacious, so reckless, that only a dying empire could conceive it. To Admiral Toyota, chief of the combined fleet, the operation was a sword drawn with both hands. To the men who would carry it out, it was closer to a death march. The Northern Decoy Group, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, carried the ghosts of Japan's naval air arm. Once proud carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda steamed toward the Philippine Sea with barely 100 aircraft between them. Most of their decks were nearly empty. Some aircraft lacked trained pilots. Others carried no ammunition. Their purpose was simple: to die visibly. Ozawa knew his force was bait. His mission was to attract Admiral William Bull Halsey's Third Fleet, the most powerful carrier force in history, and pull it away from Leyte Gulf. The irony was cruel. 2 years earlier, the sight of Japanese carriers had sent panic through the Pacific. Now they were a hollow illusion, steaming toward annihilation to preserve a flicker of national pride. Meanwhile, to the south, Admiral Kurita's center force, with Yamato, Musashi, and a dozen heavy cruisers prepared to break through the San Bernardino Strait. If successful, they would fall upon the vulnerable. American escort carriers and landing craft near Leyte. Japan's last hope rested on deception, and on the Americans' belief that the northern carriers were still a deadly threat. On the morning of October 24, 1944, U.S. reconnaissance planes spotted Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea. American carrier aircraft swarmed the formation in wave after wave. Striking relentlessly at 10:30 a.m., the battleship Musashi, the heaviest warship ever built, took more than 20 torpedo hits and dozens of bombs before capsizing and sinking. The ocean swallowed her whole, but Kurita pressed on. Despite the loss, his remaining ships forced their way through the San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness. To the north, Admiral Halsey, deceived by Ozawa's decoy, took the bait. Believing he had found Japan's main carrier force, Halsey ordered his entire fleet northward, leaving the invasion beaches unguarded. It was the perfect illusion, Japan's final trick. At dawn on October 25th, Kurita's battleships and cruisers erupted from the morning fog and sighted a small group of American escort carriers, Taffy 3, off Samar Island. The Americans were completely outgunned. They faced 14-inch battleship shells with wooden-decked escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts. Yet instead of fleeing, they charged. The destroyers, Johnston, Howell, and Heermann launched torpedo attacks straight into the Japanese battle line, weaving through shell fire in what would become one of the most courageous naval actions in history. American aircraft, mostly armed with bombs for ground attack, dove on the enemy ships again and again, strafing and bluffing runs even after expending all ammunition. Kurita, believing he had encountered a full American carrier group, grew confused. Reports claimed to cite Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown, those same names that haunted Japan's war rooms for years. In the fog of battle, the illusion of America's invincible, ever-returning carriers once again distorted Japan's sense of reality. By mid-morning, Kurita ordered retreat. He turned back, leaving Leyte untouched. The greatest surface fleet Japan had ever assembled, led by the most powerful battleships ever built, had been driven off by a handful of small escort carriers and destroyers. To the north, Halsey's fleet finally fell upon Ozawa's decoy group. The carriers that had once terrorized the Pacific were now defenseless hulks. Zuikaku, last survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, was struck repeatedly and sank beneath the waves, her crew saluting as the flag came down. Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda soon followed. The Japanese carrier force, once the pride of the Pacific, was gone. The bait had been taken, the trap had failed, and Japan's navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force. In just 3 days, the Imperial Navy lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and over 10,000 men. The Americans lost only a few small escort ships, but gained something immeasurable: total control of the Pacific. As the smoke cleared over the Philippine Sea, the myth that began at Pearl Harbor ended here, not with thunder, but with silence. The ocean that once echoed with Japanese victory cries now carried the hum of American engines. The same carrier names reborn, unstoppable and eternal. The unsinkable fleet had become a living truth. By November 1944, the once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The seas that had once trembled under the thunder of Yamato's guns now lay eerily still. Only scattered remnants remained: crippled cruisers limping back to Japan, submarines operating blindly without coordination, and destroyers stripped of fuel and hope. In a single year, Japan had lost 11 aircraft carriers, battleships, 19 cruisers, over 30 destroyers, and, most irreparably, nearly 90% of its trained naval aviators. The defeat was not merely numerical, it was spiritual: the death of Japan's naval soul. Tokyo's once proud Admiralty offices, where maps of the Pacific had stretched across polished conference tables, now stood silent. Reports arrived daily of ships that never returned, of pilots who vanished into the sea. The very officers who had once cheered the victory at Pearl Harbor now stared at charts showing only loss after loss. For the Japanese High Command, the question was no longer how to win, but how to delay defeat. Across the ocean, in the vast shipyards of America, the war machine moved with terrifying precision. At Newport News, Norfolk, Mare Island, and Puget Sound, steel plates rang under hammers day and night. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy had launched 28 new fleet carriers, 71 Satusoundon Tabanwan escort carriers, 349 destroyers, and more aircraft than Japan had built in the entire war. Each new hull was a monument to a nation's industrial heartbeat. A carrier could be sunk, but the idea of it, the system that built it, could not. When Japan's spies reported that Lexington and Yorktown had returned, they were unknowingly describing the product of an industrial miracle. American production lines had transformed warfare into mass regeneration. Where Japan saw ships as sacred, irreplaceable symbols, America saw them as systems, modular, repeatable, endlessly renewable. The difference defined the war's outcome. For Japan's sailors and aviators, the realization came slowly, painfully. Letters from the front, the few that survived censorship, carried tones of quiet despair. One pilot wrote before a kamikaze mission, "We no longer fight to win. We fight to exist for one more hour." In their training schools, instructors had begun teaching suicide tactics, not as desperation, but as doctrine. It was all that was left. Many Japanese officers admitted privately that they no longer understood the war's direction. They had fought an enemy they thought could be demoralized, but found one that rebuilt itself faster with every loss. Every time an American carrier sank, 2 more seemed to rise from the ocean. It was a sight that shattered the Imperial Navy's collective will. To fight the United States was no longer seen as war. It was seen as resistance against time itself. Victory in the Pacific did not come with cheers, but with exhaustion. For the sailors who had survived Coral Sea, Midway, and Leyte, the sense of triumph was mixed with disbelief. They had seen ships burn and vanish, only to walk once more upon decks carrying the same names. To them, the return of the carriers wasn't only industrial, it was emotional. Each New York town or Lexington was a ghost given flesh. Each battle won was a memorial to those who had gone down before. The American carrier sailors knew they were part of something larger than revenge. They were part of a machine that had learned how to turn tragedy into power. As one officer aboard the Enterprise wrote in his journal, "We came back not because we could, but because we had to. If they saw us return, they would know the war was already over." In Tokyo, intercepted broadcasts of those same carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Hornet, filled the airwaves. The Japanese Navy's analysts no longer asked if they were real. They simply listened and understood what it meant. Japan was fighting ghosts that would never die. By early 1945, Japan's empire existed only on paper. The once sprawling defensive perimeter, from the Marianas to the Solomons, had collapsed. American carrier task forces now ranged freely across the Pacific, striking wherever they pleased. From the decks of Enterprise, Yorktown, and Lexington, waves of carrier-borne aircraft hammered Japan's remaining ports and shipyards. They destroyed oil depots, airfields, and naval facilities faster than the Japanese could rebuild them. The nation that once dominated the Pacific now had almost no fuel, no trained air crews, and no illusions left. In that desolation, Japan prepared for its final act, the Operation Ten-Go, the suicide sortie of Yamato. Yamato was the most powerful battleship ever built. 72,000 tons of steel, 9 18-inch guns, and a crew of 300 men. To the Japanese, she was more than a ship. She was the embodiment of imperial pride, a floating shrine to the emperor's power. But by 1945, she had no air cover, no fuel, and no future. On April 6, 1945, Yamato received her final orders. Sail south toward Okinawa, beach herself on the shore, and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. It was not a mission, it was ritual suicide on a national scale. As she left the inland sea, sailors lined the decks in silence. No band played, no flags waved. Many knew they would never return. Some carried letters sealed in bottles, hoping the tides would deliver them home. At dawn on April 7th, radar screens aboard the U.S. carriers Essex, Yorktown, Hornet, Bunker Hill, and Intrepid lit up with massive contacts. Over 380 American aircraft were launched in waves. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters filled the sky, the same machines that had carried the ghosts of Lexington and Enterprise through every Pacific storm. Within 2 hours, Yamato was a burning wreck. She took more than 10 torpedo hits and multiple bomb strikes before capsizing. Her magazines detonated in an explosion so powerful it was seen 100 miles away. Of her 3,300 men, barely 300 survived. The greatest warship ever built by Japan had perished without firing a single meaningful salvo at an enemy ship. The Yamato's death was not just the end of a vessel. It was the symbolic death of the Imperial Navy itself. When the smoke cleared, the Pacific belonged entirely to the Americans. Their carrier fleets, now numbering in the hundreds, roamed unopposed. From those decks, raids struck Tokyo, Okinawa, Formosa, and the South China Sea. Each new strike group carried the same names: Enterprise, Hornet, Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp. To the Japanese public, those names had become synonymous with inevitability. Every broadcast of an air raid began with one of them. The Ghost Fleet that once returned from ruin was now the undisputed master of the Pacific. And yet, even in victory, there was a sense of melancholy. For sailors who had fought from 1942 to 1945, each returning name carried memories of fire, of smoke, of lost comrades. The same decks that now glistened under Pacific sunlight had once been shrouded in black oil and blood. Victory, they knew, had come not from triumph, but from endurance. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, no major warship remained seaworthy. The once proud combined fleet, the terror of the Pacific, now rested beneath it. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, one of Japan's last surviving naval commanders, summed up the mood in his post-war interrogation. "We lost the war the day the first American ship returned to battle after being sunk. We could destroy ships, but not their will." In the harbors of Tokyo Bay, American carriers anchored quietly as Japan signed the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Nearby lay Enterprise, the ship that had survived every major battle of the Pacific. She had fought longer and harder than any carrier in history, a living symbol of everything Japan had failed to understand. The Imperial Navy had vanished, but the legacy of its struggle had forged a new era of naval warfare, one ruled not by battleships or flags, but by carriers and the machines they launched into the sky. The ocean, once divided by empires, now reflected only one flag. The Pacific today lies calm, a vast, blue silence over what was once the largest battlefield on Earth. Beneath its waves rest the bones of ships and men, scattered across thousands of miles, American, Japanese, Australian, Filipino. The sea remembers everything. For Japan, the war was a tragedy of vision, a belief that spirit could outlast machinery, that courage could defy arithmetic. For America, it was a revelation that resolve, organization, and industry could rebuild faster than war could destroy. The resurrected carriers were not simply machines of steel. They were emblems of something deeper, a civilization's capacity to learn, to adapt, and to refuse despair. Each time a ship bearing the same name returned to battle, it told the enemy and the world that defeat was not final. Yorktown, Lexington, Hornet, Wasp, Enterprise, their names became more than naval designations. They became symbols of an idea, that a nation's strength lies not in how it strikes, but in how it rises. In the years that followed, aircraft carriers would become the new arbiters of global power. Battleships faded into history. Sea power was no longer about armor, but reach, the ability to project will across oceans. Every modern supercarrier that sails today carries the legacy of those early ships that refused to stay sunk. But beyond strategy and machines lies something profoundly human. The Pacific War revealed that the greatest weapon in any arsenal is not the ship, nor the gun, nor the plane, but the will to rebuild what has been lost. In that truth lies the quiet lesson of the Ghost Fleet. That resilience, not destruction, defines victory. As the sun sets over the calm Pacific, one can almost imagine the outlines of those carriers still moving across the horizon. Silent, eternal, untouchable, not as instruments of war anymore, but as shadows of a time when humanity learned that even in ruin, there is the power to return. And that, perhaps, was the greatest shock of all.